6 months had passed as the Council voted to grant humanity conditional integration into galactic civilization. The decision had not been unanimous, and many species still watched the humans with suspicion and fear. But the majority had chosen hope over caution and curiosity over ancient warnings. Humans were allowed to leave Earth, to settle on approved worlds, to participate in trade and diplomacy and cultural exchange, but they would be watched closely and constantly by observers from every major faction who would report any sign of the danger that the founders had predicted. What the Council did not anticipate was how quickly humans would adapt to this scrutiny. They did not resist it or complain about it or try to hide their activities from the watchful eyes that followed them everywhere. Instead, they welcomed the observers into their homes and their schools and their hospitals. They invited them to share meals and attend celebrations and witness every aspect of human life, hiding nothing and explaining everything with a patience that seemed almost inhuman. If you want to understand us, you should see us as we truly are, Dr. Minjum Park told a delegation of nervous Keth observers who had arrived expecting to find evidence of sinister plans. We have nothing to hide. Within 6 months, human communities had sprouted on 37 different worlds. Small settlements that grew larger every day as more humans escaped through the now open barrier around Sol System. Each community was different, shaped by the planet it occupied and the species it neighbored. But all of them shared certain qualities that the observers found both familiar and strange. Humans worked hard, harder than most species considered healthy or necessary. They built and planted and created with an energy that seemed endless, transforming barren land into productive farms and empty buildings into warm homes. They formed relationships with their alien neighbors at a speed that continued to astound even the most experienced diplomats. A human family would move into a new settlement, and within weeks, they would know the names of every being on their street, the birthdays of every child in the neighborhood, the hopes and fears and dreams of strangers who had somehow become friends. Human doctors began serving in alien hospitals, bringing with them a different approach to medicine that emphasized prevention and patient care alongside treatment. They asked questions about lifestyle and diet and emotional health, seeing their patients as whole beings rather than collections of symptoms to be fixed. Human engineers worked alongside species that had mastered space travel before Earth's dinosaurs went extinct. And somehow they still found ways to contribute. They approached problems differently, asking why not instead of why and suggesting solutions. That seemed impossible until they actually worked, but it was in diplomacy that humans truly exceeded all expectations. The Threscan Republic and the Valorian sovereignty had been locked in a cold war for nearly 900 years, a conflict rooted in ancient grievances and mutual distrust that had resisted every attempt at resolution. Human diplomats, working with the blessing of both governments, managed to broker a peace treaty in just 4 months. They did it not through clever manipulation or subtle threats, but through something much simpler. They listened. They sat with leaders from both sides and asked them to explain their grievances, really explain them. From the very beginning, they traced the conflict back to its origins and helped both sides understand how they had arrived at this point of mutual hatred. And then they asked a question that no one had thought to ask in 9 centuries. What would it take for you to forgive each other? The question was so unexpected that both sides had to stop and think about it. Really think about it, for the first time in generations, and in that pause, in that moment of reflection, they found room for something new. Council historian Jae Min had been assigned to document human integration, traveling from world to world and recording everything she observed. She had expected to find evidence of the danger that the founders had warned about. Signs that humans were somehow corrupting or conquering the galaxy as predicted. Instead, she found something far more unsettling. She found that everyone she talked to seemed happier than before planets, with human populations reported increased productivity and decreased conflict. Species that had never cooperated before were forming partnerships and alliances that crossed ancient boundaries. Ideas were spreading faster than ever, carried by human curiosity and enthusiasm and refusal to accept that some problems could never be solved. On the 6-month anniversary of the council vote, Jae-min traveled to Thresken Prime to interview Dr. Min-jun Park one final time. She found the human doctor in a small garden behind her residence, tending to plants that had grown from seeds brought all the way from Earth. "I have one question that I have never been able to answer," Jae-min said as she watched Min-jun work the soil with her bare hands. "The founders imprisoned your species for 12,000 years, and you have every right to be angry about that, but you do not seem angry at all." Min-jun paused in her gardening and looked up at the alien historian with an expression of gentle sadness. "We were never prisoners," she said quietly. "We were seedlings waiting for spring." She explained that humans had always known, somewhere deep in their collective soul, that they were meant for something greater than one small planet. They had looked up at the stars and dreamed of the day when they would finally reach them. "The barrier kept us contained, but it also kept us safe," she said. "It gave us time to grow and learn and become ready for what came next." She smiled and returned to her gardening, her hands moving through the soil with practiced ease. Perhaps the founders knew that all along. The story ended on Nexus Prime, in the Grand Assembly Chamber, where humanity's fate had been decided. Chancellor Morvith-Ka stood at the entrance to the chamber, waiting for a very special arrival. She had served the council for nearly 3 centuries and had witnessed countless historic moments. But this one felt different somehow, more important than anything that had come before. The first human child had been born outside of Earth's solar system. A baby girl delivered in a hospital on Thresken Prime just 3 days earlier. The parents had named her Su Yeon, which meant perfect and graceful in their language, and they had accepted the Chancellor's invitation to present her before the council. No council leader had ever attended the birth of a new species member before. It simply was not done, but Morvith-Ka had insisted. Traveling across the galaxy to be present at the moment when humanity officially became part of galactic civilization, she had held the infant in her mechanical arms and felt something stir in her ancient heart. Something that might have been hope or wonder, or perhaps just the simple joy of witnessing new life. As the parents entered the chamber with their daughter, delegates from hundreds of species rose to their feet in a gesture of respect that had been borrowed from human tradition. The applause filled the ancient space like thunder, echoing off walls that had stood for millennia and would stand for millennia more. And Chancellor Morvith-Ka, watching the small human child sleep peacefully in her mother's arms, finally understood what the founders had truly feared. They had not been afraid that humans would conquer the galaxy through force or guile. They had been afraid that the galaxy would learn to love them, and looking at the faces of the delegates around her, seeing the warmth and curiosity and hope in their alien eyes, she knew that it was already far too late to stop it. The quarantine had failed, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The Grand Assembly Chamber fell silent as Dr. Min-jun Park walked toward the central podium. She was small by galactic standards, barely reaching the shoulder height of most delegates, and she moved with a careful grace that suggested she was aware of every eye watching her. The quantum broadcast carrying this moment reached across the entire galaxy, connecting billions of beings on thousands of worlds in what would become the largest audience in recorded history. Min-jun had been chosen by the other humans, not because she was the smartest or the strongest or the most experienced in matters of politics and diplomacy. They had chosen her because she was a doctor, someone who had spent her entire life trying to help others and who understood that healing sometimes required courage more than medicine. She reached the podium and looked out at the sea of alien faces before her, seeing creatures of every shape and size and color, being so different from herself that she could barely comprehend their existence, and yet she was not afraid. "I am not here to beg for our lives," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I am not here to threaten you or demand anything from you, or pretend that humans are perfect beings who have never made mistakes." She paused and let her words settle over the chamber like a gentle rain. "I am here to tell you who we are." She started with Earth, describing a planet that seemed designed to kill everything that lived upon it. She spoke of earthquakes that swallowed cities and hurricanes that leveled coastlines and volcanoes that buried entire civilizations beneath rivers of fire. She described predators that hunted humans for food and diseases that swept through populations like wildfire and ice, ages that covered half the planet in frozen death. Our world tried to destroy us every single day, she said, and every single day we refused to die. She told them about human history, not hiding the darkness that had filled so many of its pages. She spoke of wars that killed millions and empires that enslaved entire populations, and cruelties that shamed her to recall. "We were terrible to each other," she admitted. "We fought over land and resources and ideas, and we caused suffering that still echoes through our collective memory." But she also told them about the other side of human nature, the side that rebuilt after every disaster and reached out to help strangers, even when help was dangerous and costly. She described how humans had learned, slowly and painfully over thousands of years, that cooperation meant survival. "We discovered that we were stronger together than apart," she said. "It took us a very long time to learn that lesson, and we are still learning it. But we never stopped trying to be better than we were." She looked directly at Admiral Sumho of the militant bloc, meeting his hostile gaze without flinching. "You are right to be cautious," she told him. "We are capable of great destruction, and our history proves it." Then she turned to the moderate coalition with equal honesty. "And you are right to hope," she said. "We are also capable of great compassion, and our history proves that as well." She asked the delegates to consider what 43 humans had accomplished in just 2 months on Threskin Prime. They had cured a plague that had resisted treatment for decades, not because they possessed superior technology, but because they looked at the problem differently and tried solutions that others had dismissed as impossible. They had formed friendships with species that had been enemies for centuries, not through political manipulation, but through genuine curiosity and care. They had shared everything they had and asked for nothing in return except the chance to learn and grow and contribute. "You feared what we might become," she said, "but did you ever consider what we might offer?" She told them about human doctors who would travel anywhere to help anyone in need. She described human engineers who solved problems by refusing to accept that problems were unsolvable. She spoke of human artists who created beauty that could move hearts across any cultural divide, and she talked about human stubbornness, the quality that the founders had feared most of all. "We do not give up," she said. "When something is broken, we try to fix it. And when the first attempt fails, we try again. And when we have failed 1,000 times, we try 1,000 more." She smiled for the first time since she had begun speaking, a small and warm expression that seemed somehow too gentle for the magnitude of the moment. "You can kill us if you choose," she said quietly. "You can send us back behind your barrier and pretend we never escaped. And we might never have the strength to escape again." Her smile faded as she continued. "But you would be killing something precious. something that could help your galaxy become more than it has ever been. She made no demands and issued no ultimatums. She simply asked for a chance. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after she finished speaking. The delegates processing her words and struggling with emotions they had not expected to feel then. From the very back of the chamber, a single pair of hands began to clap together in a rhythmic pattern. It was Elder Counselor Taeyang of the Forgotten Peoples. Using a gesture that the delegates had learned from watching human broadcasts over the past few weeks, the gesture was called applause, and it meant approval and respect and admiration. Another delegate joined in. Then another, then another. The sound grew like a wave building toward shore, spreading through the chamber as more and more beings added their voices to the growing chorus of support. Not everyone participated. Admiral Sung-ho kept his massive claws folded across his chest, and many of the militant bloc delegates remained stubbornly silent. But enough of them joined the chamber filled with a sound that no one had ever heard in that ancient space. A sound of hope and possibility, and the beginning of something new. Chancellor Morvith Kai watched the applause spread through her chamber and felt something shift in her ancient heart. She had lived for centuries and had seen wonders and horrors beyond counting. But she had never seen anything quite like this. Small human woman who had stood before the most powerful assembly in the galaxy and asked for nothing more than a chance. She raised her mechanical arms and called for silence. The council will vote. Again, she announced, and this time everyone knew what the result would be. Representatives from all 847 member species had gathered for the first complete council session in recorded history, filling every seat and overflowing into the corridors and observation galleries that surrounded the massive circular room. Some delegates had traveled for weeks to reach Nexus Prime, crossing entire sectors of space, because they understood that whatever happened in this chamber would shape the future of the galaxy. Chancellor Morvith Ka stood at the central podium and looked out at the sea of faces before her, seeing fear and anger and confusion reflected in thousands of different eyes. She had served the council for nearly 3 centuries and had guided it through wars and plagues and disasters that threatened to tear civilization apart, but she had never faced a decision like this one. We are here to determine the fate of humanity, she announced, her voice carrying through the chamber with the help of ancient amplification technology. The quarantine has failed, and we must decide how to respond. The debate that followed was the most heated in council history, with faction leaders shouting over each other and ancient alliances fracturing under the weight of fear and uncertainty. Admiral Sung-ho of the Keth Dominion spoke first for the militant bloc, his massive form rising from his seat like a mountain coming to life. There is only one acceptable response, he declared with a voice like grinding stone. We must re-establish the quarantine immediately and return all escaped humans to their system of origin, by force if necessary. He paused and let his words sink in before continuing with even darker suggestions. Or, we must eliminate the threat entirely before it can spread any further. Gasps and shouts erupted from the moderate delegates. But Admiral Sung-ho stood firm in his position. The founders quarantined these beings for a reason. He reminded the chamber, we may not know exactly why, but we know they were wise enough to build a civilization that has lasted for millennia, and we should trust their judgment even if we do not understand it. Ambassador Hana Ray of the Valorian sovereignty rose to speak for the moderate coalition. Her forearms spread wide in a gesture of appeal. We cannot condemn an entire species based on the fears of beings who vanished 10,000 years ago, she argued. The humans on Threskin Prime have shown no signs of aggression or hostility, and they have actually helped our allies in ways we never expected. She described the plague that humans had cured and the friendships they had formed and the questions they had asked that were already changing how the Threscans thought about old problems. Perhaps the founders were wrong, she suggested. Perhaps their fear was based on misunderstanding rather than true knowledge. The militant bloc erupted in protest at this suggestion, accusing the moderates of naive optimism and dangerous foolishness. The debate raged back and forth for hours, with neither side willing to give ground and both sides growing more entrenched in their positions with each passing moment. Then a small voice rose from the back of the chamber, cutting through the noise with a clarity that silenced even the loudest delegates. Perhaps we should ask them. The speaker was Elder Councillor Taeyang, a representative of the Forgotten Peoples, a coalition of species that had nearly been wiped out by past council decisions and had learned the hard way what happened when powerful beings made choices about the fate of others without asking permission. We are debating what to do with the humans, as if they were objects to be moved or problems to be solved. Taeyang said, but they are thinking beings with their own hopes and fears and desires, and they might have opinions about what should happen to them. The suggestion was so unexpected that the chamber fell silent for several long moments in thousands of years of council history. No species had ever been invited to speak at their own judgment. It simply was not done. But before anyone could object, Chancellor Morvith Khan nodded slowly and ordered council observers to travel to Threskin Prime and assess the situation directly. The observers arrived to find something none of them had expected. The human population had grown to 43 as more had escaped through the same breach in the quantum barrier they had established. A small community on the outskirts of the capital city, building shelters from local materials and growing food in gardens they had planted with seeds given to them by Threskin neighbors. They were learning languages at a speed that astounded the observers, picking up 3 different alien tongues in just a few weeks through nothing more than conversation and practice. They were teaching Threskin children games that involved running and jumping and laughing, activities that seemed pointless, but somehow made everyone feel happier. They were sharing food with strangers and telling stories about their home world and asking endless questions about everything they saw. And when an elderly Valorian diplomat died of natural causes while visiting the human settlement, the humans attended her funeral. They had known her for only 6 days, but they wept as if they had lost a member of their own family. They spoke words of comfort to her colleagues and sat with them through the night, and shared memories of a being they had barely begun to know. The observers recorded everything and sent their reports back to Nexus Prime, where the delegates watched in confused silence. This was the great threat that the founders had feared so much, that they had sealed an entire species behind an unbreakable barrier for 12,000 years. These soft-skinned beings who cried at funerals and played games with children and asked questions about everything. When the vote was finally called, the result was something that had never happened in council history. 423 species voted for recontainment or elimination. 424 species voted for observation and caution. The council was deadlocked. Chancellor Morvith Ka stood at her podium and felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon her shoulders as she searched for a way forward. Then she remembered an ancient law, a provision that had been written into the founding documents, but had never been used because no one had ever needed it. The accused may speak in their own defense, she announced. A human representative will address the council. The chamber erupted into chaos once again, but this time there was something different in the noise. Something that might have been curiosity or hope or fear of what would happen when humanity finally had a chance to speak for itself. The fate of an entire species would be decided not by votes or weapons or ancient fears, but by words, and words, as the founders had discovered long ago, were something humans wielded better than almost any other species in the galaxy. Council historian Jamin descended into the depths beneath the Chamber of Origins, her footsteps echoing through corridors that had not seen a visitor in over 2,000 years. She was one of only 3 beings in the entire galaxy with clearance to enter the Forbidden Archive, a responsibility she had inherited from her predecessor and had hoped never to actually use. The air grew colder as she went deeper, and the lights flickered with age as ancient power systems struggled to maintain their function after so many millennia of neglect. The Forbidden Archive was not a room but a vault, sealed behind doors made of materials that modern science could not identify or replicate. Jamin pressed her palm against the recognition panel and felt a strange tingling sensation as the ancient technology scanned her biological signature and compared it against records that were older than most civilizations. The doors groaned open with a sound like thunder, revealing a chamber filled with crystalline storage devices that glowed with soft inner light. Each crystal contained knowledge that they, founders, had deemed too dangerous or too important for general access. Secrets that had been locked away when the galaxy was young and the council was just beginning to take shape. Jamin moved through the rows of glowing crystals until she found the one she sought. A deep red stone that pulsed with warning symbols in a body of a deep red stone and a pudding stone that pulsed with warning symbols in a language she could barely read. She placed her hand upon it and felt the knowledge flow into her mind like water pouring into an empty vessel. What she learned made her legs grow weak and her heart beat faster with something that might have been fear or wonder or both. Founders had not quarantined Earth because they feared human weapons or human aggression or human technology 12,000 years ago. Humans had possessed none of those things in any significant measure. They had been primitive by galactic standards, still bound to their single planet and still fighting among themselves over resources and territory. No. The founders had feared something far more fundamental and far more terrifying. They had feared human adaptability. The records contained biological scans taken from human subjects during the observation period, detailed analyses that showed something the founders had never encountered in any other species. Humans could survive almost anything. Their immune systems did not simply fight disease, but learn from it, adapting and growing stronger with each new challenge. Their bodies could adjust to extreme temperatures, varying gravity, toxic atmospheres, and radiation levels that would kill most other beings within hours. Their minds refused to accept defeat, even when logic and reason demanded surrender, pushing forward through obstacles that should have been insurmountable. The founders had run projections using their most advanced predictive algorithms, calculations that took into account every variable they could measure and many they could only guess at. The results had been unanimous and terrifying. If humans ever reached the stars, they would spread to every habitable world in the galaxy within 3,000 years, not through conquest or war or domination, but through sheer persistence and refusal to stop trying. They would fill every ecological niche and adapt to every environment, and make themselves at home in places where no other species could survive. The galaxy would become human, not because humans would take it by force, but because humans would simply never stop expanding and adapting. And growing, Jamin sat back from the crystal and tried to process what she had learned as her mind struggled to accept the implications. The quarantine had never been about protecting the galaxy from human violence. It had been about protecting it from human success. Meanwhile, on Threscom Prime, the 17 escaped humans were already proving the founders' predictions correct. They had been on the planet for only 3 weeks, and they had already begun to change everything around them. A plague had been spreading through the lower districts of the capital city, a disease that Threskin doctors had been unable to cure despite decades of research. The humans had examined the sick and identified the problem within days, recognizing similarities to diseases they had encountered on Earth and developing treatments from local materials that the Threscans had never thought to use in that way within 2 weeks. The plague was retreating, and the sick were recovering, and the Threscans were looking at their human guests with something approaching reverence. But that was only the beginning of the disruption. The humans had somehow befriended members of the Valorian diplomatic delegation, a species that had been in cold conflict with the Threscans for nearly 1,000 years. They had done it simply by being curious and asking questions and listening to answers without judgment. They wanted to understand why the two species had been fighting. And when they heard the reasons, they had asked more questions that made both sides think about their conflict in ways they never had before. They asked questions that nobody had thought to ask in millennia. Simple questions like, why do you do it this way? And have you ever tried doing it differently? And what would happen if you worked together instead of apart? Some of these questions had obvious answers that everyone already knew, but others opened doors that had been closed for so long that people had forgotten they existed. Jae-min continued reading the founders' records and found detailed observations of early human society, notes that described their strange tendency to form bonds with other species and even with inanimate objects. Humans gave names to their tools and spoke to their animals as if they were equals and mourned the loss of creatures that other species would consider mere property. They formed emotional attachments with a speed and intensity that the founders had found deeply unsettling, creating loyalty and affection where none had existed before through nothing more than shared experience and mutual care. The founders had watched humans befriend predators that should have eaten them, turn enemies into allies through nothing more than persistent kindness, and rebuild communities after disasters that should have destroyed them completely. And the founders had been afraid at the very end of the records. Jae-min found a final note written in the hand of the last founder to leave Nexus Prime before the entire species vanished into the unknown. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that pressed down on her soul like a stone. We contained them to protect ourselves, but if containment fails, pray they forgive us. Jae-min stared at those words for a long time as the crystals glowed around her, and the silence of the ancient vault pressed against her ears. She had come seeking answers about why humans were dangerous. Instead, she had found a warning about what would happen when humans discovered that the galaxy had been afraid of them all along. She wondered if forgiveness was something humans were capable of, or if the founders' fear had created an enemy where none had existed before. Only time would tell. And time was something the galaxy might no longer have. Monitoring Officer Yun Seo had spent 14 years staring at the same screens, watching the same empty space, and filing the same reports that nobody ever reads. Sentinel Station Kappa 7 was considered the most boring assignment in the entire galaxy. A punishment post where careers went to die and ambition faded into nothing. The station orbited at the edge of Sol System's Orc cloud, part of an ancient network of platforms that surrounded one small, insignificant star and its collection of rocky planets for 12,000 years. This quarantine had held without a single incident. Yoseo was a Valorian, a tall and slender being with pale blue skin and 4 arms that she rarely needed to use since her job required nothing more than watching and waiting. She had requested transfers 17 times and been denied 17 times because someone had to watch the humans, even if the humans had never once tried to leave their tiny corner of space. The quantum barrier was supposed to be perfect and unbreakable and eternal on this particular morning. As Yun Seo sipped her third cup of stimulant tea and considered whether she should file for transfer number 18, her console made a sound she had never heard before. It was an alarm, but not the kind that signaled a malfunction or a supply delivery. This alarm was old and dusty and buried so deep in the station's programming that Yun Seo had to search through 3 separate databases just to understand what it meant. Breach detected. She stared at the words for a long moment, certain that she was misreading them or that the system had finally broken down after millennia of neglect. Then she pulled up the sensor data and her 4 hands began to tremble. A ship had passed through the quantum barrier. It was small and ugly and built from pieces that clearly did not belong together. A patchwork vessel made of salvaged debris and desperate engineering. The hull was constructed from at least 6 different alien materials, scraps that must have drifted into the quarantine zone over thousands of years and been collected by beings who had no right to possess such technology, yet somehow they had made it work. Yun Seo watched the ship's trajectory with growing horror as it moved away from the barrier and toward open space, toward the shipping lanes where merchant vessels traveled between a dozen different worlds. She should have fired the station's weapons and destroyed the vessel before it could go any further. That was the protocol, the ancient law that every monitoring officer learned on their first day. But her hands would not move to the firing controls because the ship was so small and so fragile, and the beings inside had done something that should have been impossible. They deserved at least a moment of freedom before she ended their journey. That moment of hesitation cost the galaxy everything. By the time Yun Seo finally reached for the weapons console, the human vessel had already made contact with a Threscan merchant convoy that was passing through the sector on a routine trading mission. The Threscans were a friendly species, curious and welcoming and completely unaware that the quarantine around Sol system even existed. Most species had forgotten about the humans entirely, since 12,000 years was a long time, and the galaxy had other concerns. The merchant captain, a cheerful being named Dovran, responded to the human distress signal with enthusiasm and open arms. He had never seen beings like these before. With their soft skin and their bright eyes and their strange way of communicating through sound and expression, they seemed frightened but also excited, like children taking their first steps into a world much larger than they had ever imagined. Dovran offered them food and shelter and passage to Threscan Prime, never suspecting that he was committing what some would consider the greatest crime in galactic history. By the time Yuseo's distress call reached Council headquarters on Nexus Prime, 17 humans had already set foot on an alien world for the first time. They walked through streets filled with beings they had only dreamed about, touched buildings made of materials that Earth had never known, and breathed air that had been recycled through systems more advanced than anything their species had ever built. The Threscans welcomed them as guests and showed them wonders that made the humans weep with joy and amazement. News of the strange visitors spread quickly through Threscan society, and within days, the entire planet was talking about the soft-skinned beings from the quarantine star. Meanwhile, on Nexus Prime, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session for the first time in 800 years. The Great Chamber filled with representatives from hundreds of species, all of them confused and alarmed by the sudden summons. Most had no idea what the emergency could possibly be, since the galaxy had been at peace for generations and no major threats had emerged in living memory. Chancellor Morvith Ka stood at the central podium, her ancient body supported by mechanical limbs that whirred and clicked with each movement. She was the oldest serving chancellor in council history, a being who had held her position for nearly 3 centuries and had seen empires rise and fall. But she had never faced anything like this. "The quarantine around Sol System has been breached," she announced. And the chamber erupted into chaos. Most of the delegates did not even know what Sol System was or why it had been quarantined. They shouted questions and demanded explanations, and accused each other of orchestrating some kind of elaborate hoax. Morvithka waited for the noise to subside before she continued with words that silenced the chamber completely. "The humans have escaped." She pulled up ancient records on the central display, documents that had been sealed for millennia and marked with warnings in languages that most species could no longer read. 12,000 years ago, our predecessors discovered a species of small blue planet in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy, she explained as images of Earth appeared on the screens. They observed this species for several centuries before making a decision that would shape galactic policy forever. The records showed the vote that had created the quarantine, a unanimous decision by the original council to surround Sol System with an impenetrable barrier and never allow the humans to leave. They were not quarantined because they were primitive, Morvithka said as murmurs spread through the chamber. They were quarantined because the founders deemed them too dangerous to ever be released into the galaxy. A delegate from the Keth Dominion raised one of his massive claws and demanded to know what made these humans so dangerous. Were they warriors with weapons that could destroy worlds, or conquerors with armies that could overwhelm any defense? Morvithka shook her head slowly, a mechanical support groaning with the movement. "The records do not specify the nature of the danger," she admitted as gasps of disbelief filled the chamber. That knowledge was sealed by the founders themselves, locked away in the Forbidden Archive beneath this very building. She paused and looked out at the hundreds of frightened faces before her. And the founders vanished 10,000 years ago, taking their secrets with them. The chamber fell into stunned silence as the weight of her words settled over the delegates. Like a heavy blanket, somewhere out there, 17 members of a species deemed too dangerous to release were walking freely among the stars, and nobody knew why they should be afraid.